Okay guys, today we're going to get into imperialism and basically give you the poster child for imperialism, which would be our friends in Britain. Not going to lie, this is going to be long, but it's going to be quite a ride, so let's get to it. Okay, what is imperialism? Well, let's just go to the definition from the dictionary. It's the policy of extending the rule of authority of an empire or nation over foreign countries, or of acquiring and holding colonies and dependencies, or the advocacy of imperial or sovereign interests over the interests of the dependent state. The idea is that you are going to expand out and come to control land and areas that are outside your country. Now, unlike an empire, well, it's kind of like an empire, but you don't necessarily have to occupy all of them. You just need to, as you can see here, extend the rule of authority. That is the key thing. Now, why are the Europeans able to do this? If you see there, a map on the right is at one point in 1914, the colonies of these nations, of both the European nations as well as the United States. And if you can see, basically most nations in the world today were controlled by the Europeans or us. First and foremost, you have technology, and lots of different technology, communications like the telegraphs, railroads, and guns and canals and the steam-powered vessels and all of that stuff. And just to give you an idea of one of those types of weapons, this is a Maxim machine gun that was created by a man by the name of Hiram Maxim. Okay, and this is just to give you an idea of what that gun would do.
Getting rid of all this old surplus military ammo so the kids won't get it.
Now you can imagine the damage that this gun would do to people that didn't have guns and things like that. Just this is why the Europeans are going to be in a position to conquer everybody. Now, they also had the desire to do it. They wanted to expand their political power. They wanted to get stronger as we got into the Atlantic system and the massive amounts of money that they had. And then that you had their attitude. Now, there are two different things. I have their helping in quotes. Sometimes they felt that they were better cultures and that they were a better culture, if you will, and that they were going to help these groups become more modernized. And in some cases, that will actually happen. But the fact of the matter is what they really felt was this idea, and we'll talk about it under business, if you will, of social Darwinism, or what we call scientific racism, that they feel that they have evolved and that in Europe that they have a greater culture, so that actually gives them the right. So when you put these all together, the rest of the world's in trouble. Now, Britain is going to be the key nation that leads the way, and so let's get into them. The first area that we're talking about that they're going to dominate is India. Now, when we last left India, we talked about the king Aurangzeb, who basically becomes king by the late 1600s, and he was really dividing his country, very brutal to non-Muslims. And the big thing that hit him was the Maratha uprising. The Marathas are a warrior culture that was founded by this man here, Shivaji, and he was a Hindu, and they wanted to push the Mughals out. Now, Aurangzeb, I have here, he equals Charles V. What's very similar with Charles V is that he really doesn't take the Marathas or Shivaji seriously, much like how Charles V kind of thought that, well, who's that guy Martin Luther? They started in the year 1707 with a war, and that would be successful. I'm sorry, they started in 1680. They finished in 1707, and they would topple the Mughals. And then by 1758, they would control most of India and modern-day Pakistan, as you can see on the right there, quite a large kingdom. And they would really get themselves in what they thought to be a good position. Now, just to give you an idea how awesome these warriors are, here is just a Maratha soldier, a modern-day descendant of them, and that's a real weapon. It looks all flexible, but it is actually steel that is made to do that. And on the right, he's got a spear. So yeah, he's pretty much taken all of you guys out. Now, what ends up happening is slowly but surely over time, we had talked about that the British had gained a greater area of control in India. They had set up colonies until eventually in 1761, the Marathas had actually gotten so large that they kind of split their empire up a little bit so that they can control it better. Think back to the Tetrarchy under Diocletian, and we know how that wound up. And that allowed the British to come in and enact the Anglo-Maratha War. Now, the first war they fought was from 1775 to 1781. Now, if you think about it, that's just about the same exact time as they were fighting the Americans in the American Revolution. So, if you've ever wondered why the British didn't bring their entire empire to bear on us, it's because they couldn't, because they were dealing with fighting in India. And in the end, India was much larger than the United States. It had a lot more resources, based on what they control. Remember, they don't have everything out west yet. So that was a huge deal. And basically, it's kind of a bit of a draw. In 1802, they fight the Second War, and the British start gaining. And then the Third War goes from 1817 to 1818, actually not too far after the War of 1812, and they completely crush the Marathas and take control of everything. But because they were so far flung, they're going to put the British East India in charge of everything to run for them. And that would last right up into the Sepoy Rebellion. Now, all of these areas didn't simply accept British rule. The Sepoys were Indian soldiers who fought for the British, so they were kind of like local soldiers. Think of how the many of the Gothic tribes were brought into Rome. Well, in 1857, they were given new guns, which is pretty normal, but the cartridges that they were housed in had animal fat to protect them, and the way that you were supposed to use them is to rip it off. Well, Hindus, they're not supposed to eat cows, and there was a big deal, and then so the British were like, look, you have to do this, and they're like, hey, no, we're not. And then they put a number of guys in jail for it. So the Sepoys are like, all right, fine, you want to do that, we're going to attack you. And there is actually a revolt. It's amazing what revolts start with. Also, probably tells you how much they were being oppressed. The Sepoys are able to take over a number of areas. The scariest, though, happens when they take the city of Lucknow and they kill 60 soldiers, 180 men, but also 375 women and children. Then the British were like, oh, let us remind you who we are. And the Sepoys are defeated. Thousands of them are killed. Most of them are hanged in public. And Britain then is going to come in and take control. They're going to remove the British East India Tea Company, and they are going to occupy it militarily and use a governor appointed by the Queen. Now, I will say they do some good things, okay? They bring in roads, railroads, telegraphs. They do suppress things like suttee. They will open up, if you remember, suttee was when a woman had to commit ritual suicide after her husband died. They will open up schools and canals and harbors, and actually wealthy Indians will be allowed to go to Britain for school, and they'll bring things like cricket, and it's all good. But on the other side, they are not allowed to have anything more than like kind of clerical jobs in the government. They can't vote. They don't control the economy. And that's where a guy by the name of Ram Mohan Roy is going to come in. This guy's really important. He lives from 1722 to 1833. He is a Hindu reformer, often referred to as the father of modern day India. And he's going to publish newspapers and really push for social change, and also bettering the status of women in education. The idea is that he was trying to get Indians to get more involved so that eventually maybe they can break and get their own freedom. Now, Ram Mohan Roy was really important because what happened is shortly after him, About 50 years later, remember in world history that's short, you have the creation of the Indian National Congress. The British realized that with so many Indians there, that they had to give them some level of rights. So they created this body that people would elect representatives to complain about issues and concerns from their parts of modern day India or Pakistan. And they'll do things like tariffs and trade and things along that line to try to get the British to help, because often there were problems that were exposed that the British would ignore, and that's going to be important. The most notable, which, as you see these three people here, was the drought and famine of 1876 to 1878, in which 5.5 million people basically starved to death, and you can see three people there just dying. The British did nothing to attempt to help this, and what actually is going to hurt them is that with the creation of the Indian National Congress, that's going to start to get the organization that they need. Now, of course, that freedom movement won't happen until the 1900s with Gandhi, but you can see the steps there. So you see this thing with imperialism is it's not always terribly bad, but you get things that go back and forth. Now, another big area they will expand into, and India was the key one, would be South Africa. Now, South Africa was initially taken by the Dutch, by a group of people that eventually would be called the Boers or farmers. So the Boers are descendants of Dutch settlers that set up farms. Now, you get some British in there, but for the most part, you have an area called the Dutch Free State and then the British State. But then they find diamonds in the 1800s, and the British are like, we are going to have those. And they actually will go to war with the Boers to get control of South Africa, which they do, and they will boot them out. Now, in order to hold the area, they will also have to fight a war with the Zulus, led by one Shaka Zulu, who are able to defeat the British in a number of engagements. However, they don't have many guns, and in the end, the British will take them out. What's really going to be crucial here is the guy that's going to kind of run the show here is a man by the name of Cecil Rhodes, who will establish huge mining companies and the most important diamond company in the world, De Beers, which we'll talk about them because they're very shady. But in the future, what you're going to end up see happening here is that it is the descendants of these British that will create the apartheid system, which might be undoubtedly the most oppressive government ever created by man. And oh, by the way, while they were in Africa, they take over the Sudan, most of Central Africa, and that little place we call Egypt. Oh, hey, why not? Where do you got to move to next? They are going to come over into China, and we talked about that when the Europeans start coming back into China, that they start doing lots and lots of trade, and the people of China are relatively weak, and the one good that they actually get from Pakistan that they were able to trade in China, they being the British, would be opium, and they start trading it and they're selling it, and they've got basically addicts all over the place by about 1839. Well, in 1839, the Chinese government is like, we are tired of it. These people are sick. They are dying. No more opium, and they capture 4 ships and throw all the opium into the river. It's like the Boston Tea Opium Party. It's called the Guangzhou Opium Party. There you go. Unfortunately for them, it's the British. They have guns, they have cannons, they have steamships, and yes, they go to war so they can keep selling drugs. Never thought that would happen. But in the end, they created what was called the Treaty of Nanjing, which made China give up the city of Hong Kong, and that they have to agree to allow Britain to set up their foreign policy. And they also, this is not in the notes, but I want you to write this down, and they also had to allow other European nations to come in and set up their own trading ports. And the final thing, make sure you write this down somewhere, is that foreign citizens did not have to answer to Chinese laws. They only had to answer to the laws of their home country. Oh, we're not done yet. As you look on the notes, they also have a number of places in the Caribbean. They still have Canada, which they will have for quite a long time until actually technically the 80s. They will take over in Asia, Burma or modern day Myanmar, Singapore, and Malaysia. And it just keeps going. And then, hey, they're in Asia, so we might as well set up in Australia. In 1788, they settle in Australia, and it's not a prison colony. That's what everybody thinks. The whole idea is that prisoners were given an opportunity here to come to set up and farm, and you get a massive migration. But what ends up happening is that they find gold in 1851, and it's time for everybody to come in. And guys, what you see here is the exact same thing you see in the area in the Americas. Disease hits so hard. Just to give you an idea, in 1800 there were 650,000 Aborigines. They were down to 90,000 by 1900, and the Europeans were at 3.5 million. The Maori, who would live in New Zealand, which basically all this happens in New Zealand too, would go from 200,000 to 45,000. And there were two pretty horrible things they did in Australia, that being the British. The first was called terra nullius, that they believed that the land belonged to no one. So if you can go there and claim it and work it, it's all good. Much like how the Americans saw Native Americans, or the Indians, that they didn't set up farms and stuff, so they weren't using the land, so we can take it. But the most tragic of all these policies was the White Australia policy. If you see, they even had like signs and little, I don't even know what that is, like a little medal, if you will, in which they would Aborigine children were taken from their mothers and fathers, and they were educated with whites. Their names were changed. They were looked to intermarry, and they basically tried to eliminate the Aboriginal people. And this was not actually um, made up for until the very late 1900s, like the 1990s, and many Aborigines were pushed off their land into really desert areas, and you have massive poverty of the Aborigines today. And New Zealand, by the way, different group of people, not Aborigines, called Maori, same exact thing happened. Now, I can't say that it was all that bad, okay? We got to give them some opportunity here. First, they abolished slavery everywhere they go. Bonus. Second, they end things like suttee, which I said before was the ritual suicide that Indian women were expected to commit when their husbands died. They looked to end poverty because they would increase markets and bring in capitalism. They would open up schools and increase education, and people that were in the upper class of these countries could actually go back to Britain for school. They would often build the infrastructure. The most famous right here you see on the right, that is the Suez Canal, and we know that's huge economically. And they would also try to bring in a lot of medicine, which of course was keeping them alive, but in general, those are all things that these nations did benefit from. But in the end, you had a lot of the bad things, and what was left was this. This is the British Empire. Let's minus this area out here. And they were huge, and this empire would pretty much be intact until about 1947. All right, so that was a long one. Get your questions and notes, and I will see you guys soon.